"You're not invited to my wedding." That's what my son said to me, eyes locked on mine like he was doing me a favor by being direct. "It's just, not really about you anymore, Dad." That was the moment I stopped being a father. At least to him. There were over 200 people at my son's wedding, caterers in crisp uniforms balancing towers of champagne, distant cousins I hadn't seen since my wife's funeral, coworkers he barely knew 3 years ago, and even his childhood dentist who gave him a gold star every time he sat still for a cleaning. I watched it all unfold from my living room, hunched forward in my recliner as footage rolled across social media, high-res drone shots, professional reels with music and filters, carefully curated hashtags about family, love, and forever. I stared at the screen, taking it in slowly, frame by frame, and felt something shift inside of me that I couldn't quite put into words yet. My son had gotten married without me. Not because I had passed, or because I was sick, or because I had failed him in some grave way, but because, in his words, I wasn't immediate family anymore. He told me that 4 months before the wedding, face-to-face over breakfast at a roadside diner halfway between his sleek apartment in the city and my old house in the suburbs. I'd offered to meet halfway to catch up, thinking we'd talk about honeymoon destinations or maybe what kind of music they wanted for the reception. I was the one who had paid for that car he drove down in, the one parked outside the diner window with the scratched bumper he still hadn't fixed. I didn't say anything when I paid for both our meals, like I always did, even though I noticed he didn't even hesitate when the check came. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before he glanced down at his coffee and said, with a breath that sounded like it had been rehearsed, "So listen, I want to tell you this now so it's not awkward later. You're not invited." I thought he was joking, honestly. I laughed, one of those half-laughs you let out while you wait for the punchline to land. When it didn't, I asked, "What do you mean I'm not invited?" and he didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at his coffee like it might give him the words he couldn't say himself. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "It's just gonna be close friends and family." Immediate family, really? We're keeping it small. I stared at him, waiting for the part where he said, "But of course you'll be there," but it never came. So I repeated myself, slower this time. "I'm your father." And that's when he said something that would stick with me longer than anything else from that conversation. He said, "Dad, this is about our future, not the past. Paige and I want to start fresh, and, well, things have been complicated between us. The strange thing is, we hadn't fought. We hadn't argued. There was no falling out that I knew of. I'd been at Thanksgiving. I'd bought them both Christmas gifts. I even helped him with the down payment for that engagement ring, though he never mentioned that in front of her family. The complication, I would come to realize later, was that I didn't fit the image Paige wanted to project. She was raised in a house with an elevator and a summer home with a dock. Her father was a plastic surgeon with a golf handicap and a wine cellar. Me? I run a small HVAC business and wear flannel to dinner. She used to call it authentic, back when she was still pretending to care what I thought. I remember one dinner at my place when she asked if I could not wear my work boots at the table because they made the floors smell like gas. I didn't argue. I just stepped out of them and kept passing the mashed potatoes. I thought, maybe that's just how young people talk now. After that diner conversation, I didn't hear from him much. No follow-up. No reconsideration. He'd done the hard part, delivered the news, and I think he assumed I'd just fade into the background like some outdated photograph. Then the wedding weekend came, and the internet lit up with photos and videos, all tagged and filtered and professionally edited. Paige smiling like royalty, him standing tall in a tux I had no doubt her father paid for, guests lined up in chairs wrapped in linen and wildflowers. It didn't look small. It didn't look private. It looked like a magazine shoot, like the kind of event that costs 6 figures and comes with signature cocktails named after the family dog. What broke me wasn't just that I wasn't invited, it was who was. In one video, I saw him dancing with Paige's father, both of them grinning like they'd won something. The caption read, "Two amazing dads, one lucky groom, I kept watching. More comments flooded in. So happy he finally has the father figure he deserves. Love seeing men support men like this. And then the one that finally made me close the laptop. Out with the old, in with the upgrade. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat there in silence, surrounded by years of framed photos, trophies I'd paid for, school awards I'd clapped for, and an empty guest list with my name nowhere on it. A few days later, he called, cheerful like nothing had happened. "Hey, just wanted to check in. We're back from the honeymoon. It was perfect." I told him I was glad to hear it. He asked if we were okay, and I said, of course. Then he asked if I could help them look into a mortgage, said Paige's parents had contributed what they could, but the numbers still weren't adding up. I told him I'd see what I could do and ended the call on a friendly note. He probably hung up thinking I was fine. That I understood. That I'd let it go. I didn't say anything else to him that week, or the one after that. I didn't complain to my sister or post cryptic things online or demand answers. I simply stopped reaching out. I kept working. Cleaned out some drawers I hadn't touched in years. Updated a few documents. Went through some paperwork that most people wait too long to bother with. No one noticed, which was just fine with me. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people expect. I just understood something now that I hadn't before. You don't always have to slam a door to shut it. Sometimes, you just flip the lock, and wait. After the wedding, I didn't blow up. Didn't show up at their apartment with a speech or a guilt trip. I just went quiet. No Facebook posts. No family gossip. No explanations. If anyone asked, I said I'd been under the weather or kept things low-key. Most people didn't ask. The ones who mattered knew, and the ones who didn't wouldn't have cared anyway. There's something about being excluded that makes the world a little quieter. I didn't mind. I let myself disappear from his life like a detail in a story he was trying to rewrite. But I didn't sit still. I got busy. Started going through drawers I hadn't opened in years. Sorted business records, double-checked contracts, cleaned up anything that looked messy or outdated. Got lunch with my accountant for the first time in years and asked him how complicated it would be to change certain designations, ownership, beneficiaries, that sort of thing. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Thinking of retiring," and I told him, "Just thinking ahead." He helped me draw up everything I needed. Clean, legal, quiet. I started shifting things slowly, in ways that wouldn't raise eyebrows unless you knew exactly what to look for. And still, I answered every one of my son's calls like nothing had happened. He called about once a week. Sometimes less. Usually when something wasn't working right or he had a question about money. Never an apology. Not even a hint of it. Just small talk and sideways asks. Then one night, about 2 months after the wedding, he called with a tone in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not polite. Not grateful. Just, entitled. "We've been running numbers on the mortgage," he said, "and we were thinking, what if, instead of co-signing, you just transferred part of the business to me? Like, gifted it. Ownership. Even just on paper. That way, we'd have assets to show." I didn't say anything at first. Just let the silence sit. "Obviously, it's still your company," he added, quickly. "It's just, this would help a lot with pre-approval. Paige's dad did something similar with her brother's med spa." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the calendar on the wall. I just had the LLC amended the week before. I already knew exactly whose name was and wasn't on it. "That's a big ask," I said. "It's not forever," he replied. "Just for the paperwork." I told him I'd think about it. But I already had. A few days later, Paige called me directly for the first time in over a year. I almost didn't recognize the number. Her voice was syrupy, trying too hard to sound casual. "I was just thinking," she said, "maybe I could come in and help out a few hours a week. Just like, admin stuff. Light office work. Might be fun to be part of the family business." I could hear her smile through the phone, like she was offering me a chance to be part of their family now, as long as I stayed in my lane. "That's generous of you," I said, "but I've got it under control." She pushed back, nicely, but with the same edge I'd heard from her before. That tone people use when they want to make a demand sound like a gift. She said she could help modernize things, streamline operations, add a little polish to the brand. She said it might even make the business more attractive to young buyers down the road, if I ever decided to cash out. I told her I appreciated the offer. And then I hung up and took a long, quiet walk around the block. The next morning, I ran into Carl while servicing the rooftop unit on his warehouse. We've known each other 20 years, he's the kind of guy who drinks black coffee from a thermos older than I am and thinks khakis are for funerals. He glanced at me while I was packing up my tools and said, "You've been walking like someone standing on your grave." I told him I was just thinking about the future. He gave me a look, then pointed at my van. "You built this with your hands. You get to decide who gets the keys. Not some kid who thinks the world owes him parking." He walked off before I could respond, but his words hung in the air longer than the steam rising off the coils. That night, I went home and made a few more changes. Some legal. Some structural. All invisible. I wasn't just updating paperwork. I was erasing assumptions. I was making sure every door they thought they had a key to had been quietly changed behind the scenes. Not to lock them out, but to let them walk straight into a space that no longer belonged to them. It was never about revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to see him suffer. I didn't want to humiliate him or make some grand point. I just wanted the truth to settle in his chest the same way it had settled in mine, that love given freely isn't the same as value taken for granted. I had spent years giving him everything. And he had spent the last 12 months acting like it was all his to redistribute. They started making plans openly. I could hear it in the background on his calls, Paige talking to a realtor, him quoting numbers they hadn't earned, conversations that included phrases like, "Once we get Dad's part," and, "We'll keep the logo but modernize the name." He thought he was playing chess. He didn't know I'd already taken my king off the board. He sent me a spreadsheet one night, full of projections and buzzwords. Said they were thinking about branding. Wanted to position the business for scale. He didn't even ask if it was okay. Just sent it with a smiley face and the subject line, "Exciting stuff." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. By the time he'd call to ask for help again, he'd already be standing on a floor I pulled out months ago. And I'd be watching, quiet, steady, invisible, as everything he assumed was waiting for him started slipping through the cracks. It was a Tuesday morning when I got the first real sign that they weren't just circling, they were actively trying to breach the gate. My personal banker, a man I've known for 20 years, called me directly while I was in the middle of replacing a faulty air handler at a client site. He didn't sound panicked, but he didn't waste time on pleasantries either. He told me that someone named Paige, who introduced herself as my strategic partner and co-owner, had come into the branch that morning and attempted to gain access to an old business credit line we hadn't touched in 5 years. She said they needed it reactivated for an expansion plan. She had documents, emails, buzzwords, and just enough confidence to make someone unfamiliar with my operation hesitate. But thankfully, my banker wasn't unfamiliar. She said she was listed on your business as a managing partner, he told me. But we checked. She's not. I told him to freeze it. I told him to flag my entire account profile as internal access only until further notice. He said, "I figured as much, but I thought you'd want to know." I didn't ask what she said when they turned her down. I didn't need to. I could already picture the forced smile, the practiced poise starting to crack, the way she probably made it sound like I'd made a mistake or just hadn't filed the update yet. And I knew, without question, that the moment she walked out of that branch, she called my son and turned the whole thing into a blame game, because not 24 hours later, my son called me sounding more shaken than I'd heard him in years. "Hey," he said, barely letting me say hello. "Did you deny Paige access to the account?" I kept my voice steady. I didn't deny her anything. She was never authorized to begin with. There was a pause, a longer one than usual, and then he said, "She was just trying to help. You know, get the ball rolling on some updates we've been talking about." "I'm still running the business," I said. "There is no 'we' in the paperwork." He let out a breath, not quite a sigh, more like a controlled exhale that was trying not to turn into something louder. He asked if we could talk in person sometime soon, and I told him my schedule was tight but we could try to find time. He didn't say it outright, but I could hear it in his voice. That was the first time he realized something was wrong, and that I might be the reason for it. From there, things moved faster than I expected. It was as if being told no once had broken some kind of spell. Suddenly, they were pushing harder, scrambling in ways that made it obvious how much they had already counted on access. Paige sent me an email marked urgent with a detailed list of tasks she thought I should delegate: marketing, branding, digital expansion, and she CC'd my son, her realtor, and, inexplicably, a branding consultant from some firm in Brooklyn. She ended the email with, "Looking forward to shaping the next chapter of our family legacy together." That sentence stuck with me. Not because it was warm or hopeful, but because of the way it was written, like I had already been gently moved off the stage and replaced. I didn't respond. That same week, one of my longest clients, Rich, who owns a distribution warehouse I've been servicing for over 15 years, called me to ask what the hell was going on. He said he'd received a proposal from Paige on company letterhead offering him a modernized service plan with new rates and incentives. She had signed it as the company's director of growth and included a temporary promotional rate that I never approved. Rich said, "She made it sound like you were stepping down." I told him, as calmly as I could, "That's news to me." He laughed, but it wasn't a funny laugh. He said, "Well, somebody's playing boss with your name." When I hung up, I didn't feel anger the way people expected. I didn't pace or mutter or hit anything. I just opened my records, reviewed the recent adjustments to ownership and succession, and confirmed what I already knew: they had absolutely nothing. Not a share, not a clause, not a pathway. I had removed every assumption they were building on, and they were still talking like the foundation was solid. Later that night, my son called again. He didn't try to pretend it was a casual check-in this time. He sounded tense, agitated, but oddly cautious, like he wasn't sure how far he could push without making something worse. "I just want to ask you something directly," he said. "Are you doing this on purpose?" I let that hang there for a moment, then asked him what he thought I was doing. He said, "We're getting blocked at every turn: banks, vendors, even your own damn clients. Nothing's lining up with what we were told." "And who told you?" I asked. He paused. I think he realized then that everything he thought he had was based on conversations, not contracts. "I guess I just assumed," he finally said. "That was your first mistake," I told him. He didn't say much after that, just mumbled something about needing to regroup, then hung up. And that's when I knew. It was starting to break. The following week, a realtor called me directly. Not their realtor, mine. Someone I knew, someone I trusted. She told me, confidentially, that Paige had reached out to her office asking for comps and referrals on my commercial space. Said they were looking to restructure the operation, and wanted to explore either leasing or liquidating depending on the new valuation. The request had come through on company letterhead, with a new email address that listed my business name with HQ tacked on the end. I told the realtor to forward me everything, and then I told her what was really going on. She didn't sound surprised. "You want me to kill the conversation?" she asked. "No," I said. "Let them keep digging." And that was the moment I knew we were past the point of no return. They weren't just circling anymore. They had already made moves. Public ones. Financial ones. They were bluffing with someone else's cards, and the dealer was walking back to the table. The final straw, the one that sealed the direction of everything that would follow, was a call I got from a supplier we've used for over a decade. He told me that someone claiming to be our operations manager had tried to place a bulk order using net 30 terms that were only available through my personal guarantee. The supplier flagged it because the tone of the email felt off. It was aggressive, demanding, and didn't match how we usually did business. When he forwarded me the email, I didn't even blink. Paige had signed off using a title that didn't exist. I called my son that night. He picked up after one ring. "I'm going to ask this once," I said. "Is Paige acting with your approval?" He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was low, tired. "We're just trying to get things in motion, Dad. You've been holding everything too close." I told him I wasn't holding anything. I was protecting what was mine. And then I said something that changed the temperature of the call. "You've been building a future with a pen I never handed you. And now you're signing checks that are about to bounce." There was no comeback. Just quiet. Then he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him, "I'm just running my business, son." The next morning, 3 clients called to ask if the company was under new management. A fourth said they'd received conflicting invoices. The bank called later that afternoon. And for the first time since they left me out of the wedding, it wasn't me knocking on their door. It was them, locked out, confused, and finally starting to realize. They were the ones on the outside. It all started to come apart faster than I expected. There was a point where it felt like they were juggling everything. Paige was talking big on social media again, the branding firm was still active, and I even got another pitch deck forwarded to me by a confused client. They were still trying to convince the world they were leading the transition, still sending proposals under my company's name, still talking about multi-state expansion as if any of it existed. But then came the moment where it stopped being a series of cracks, and became a full collapse. One of our top-tier commercial clients, someone who's kept our service contract for nearly a decade, forwarded me a formal proposal he received directly from Paige. It was professional-looking, sleek, and completely unauthorized. She had sent it under our letterhead, used my digital signature from a scanned invoice, and offered him reduced rates for bundling legacy services into a new platform she called ERA HVAC Solutions. I remember reading that name and sitting there for a moment, just staring at it. Not angry, almost impressed. She'd rebranded my life's work like it was a failed app she was trying to flip. But the client didn't just want to check if it was legit. He'd already looped in his legal department, and they were preparing a formal complaint against me for fraud, because I was the one technically on the books. He said, "We know you, we like you, but this kind of stunt could have cost us hundreds of thousands if we'd signed blindly." I told him I understood completely, then explained, calmly and thoroughly, that I had no knowledge of the proposal, had not approved the offer, and that any documents Paige had used were unauthorized. I didn't downplay it. I owned the cleanup because that's what professionals do. He rescinded the threat, said he appreciated the transparency, and warned me to get a leash on whoever's trying to play CEO behind your back. That was the moment. The moment the fantasy burst. After that, everything started slipping through their fingers. Clients stopped responding to Paige's outreach. Vendors began contacting me directly to confirm who was actually in charge. One supplier canceled a pending order outright, citing confusing communications from her team. Even the branding firm they had hired to help with their new identity pulled back once my attorney sent a brief but clear letter reminding them who the actual owner of the company was, and what the penalties for misrepresentation looked like. I started hearing things secondhand. A contractor I've known since before my son hit puberty called me after a run-in with him at a supply yard. He said, "I don't know what he's trying to be, but it ain't you. Kid doesn't know the first thing about square footage or duct spacing, but he talks like he invented the damn field. I didn't defend him. I didn't excuse it. I just said, thanks for letting me know. And I hung up. Then came Paige's final move. She emailed me directly for the first time since everything started unraveling. The subject line just said, "Let's be reasonable." The message wasn't long, but it was carefully worded. She said she hoped we could move forward as a family, that misunderstandings can be painful but fixable, and that it wasn't too late to embrace the future together. She didn't mention the fake client pitches. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit anything. She just tried to reframe the theft as collaboration. Like we were all working toward the same goal, and the only thing missing was my signature. I never wrote back. No reply. No reaction. Just archive. Let her sit with that. The part that stayed with me most in those final weeks wasn't the fallout, it was the quiet realization that neither of them had ever stopped to ask what I wanted. Not once. Not a call to check if I wanted to hand over the business. Not a conversation about whether I was ready to step back. Just assumption after assumption, like my entire life's work was a closet they were waiting to clean out once I finally moved out. Maybe he thought being my son was enough. Maybe she told him legacy was something you took, not earned. Either way, they never asked. They just presumed. They confused blood for permission, and history for entitlement. By the time my son called again, I could hear the fear in his voice, real fear now, not just frustration or confusion. His tone was low, not accusatory, just desperate. "Dad," he said. "I need to know, what's going on? People won't call us back. The banks won't even touch us now. Did you tell them something? Did you do something?" I kept my voice even. Measured. Honest. I didn't tell anyone anything that wasn't true. I just made sure the records reflected reality. He hesitated. Then asked, "You're not doing this on purpose, right?" I let that hang in the air for a long second. "I'm just running my business, son." He didn't respond right away. Then, with a tired, breathless laugh, like someone realizing they stepped into a room they were never invited into, he said, "So, we've been building everything on nothing." I didn't answer. Because he already knew. But here's the part he didn't know, not yet. That the contracts weren't the only thing they'd built on quicksand. That the business wasn't the only thing they'd never actually been written into. That while they were pitching ideas and posting aesthetic reels about generational wealth and building a family empire, I had already made the final changes. They thought the collapse was over. But the real damage hadn't even started. It didn't happen all at once. Revenge never does, not the kind that sticks. The real damage happens slowly, in rooms people don't know you're sitting in. Over meetings with lawyers. Over documents nobody reads until it's too late. Over conversations that never raise a voice. I didn't need to scream, and I didn't need to explain. I just signed what needed signing, shifted what needed shifting, and walked away from the rest like it was never mine to carry. The business, my business, is now held entirely in trust. Every asset, every dollar, every account and contract sits behind legal glass, structured so carefully even the most ambitious son-in-law or clout-hungry spouse would need a decade of good behavior to claw their way into it. And neither of them even lasted a year. I had the trust rewritten twice. Not just to exclude my son. But to make sure there was no loophole, no window, no soft clause that could be bent or misread by a sympathetic attorney. The language is exact. Intentional. My son was removed not just by name, but by logic. It would take a team of lawyers months to undo it, and they'd fail. Because what he assumed was waiting for him, never was. What I gave instead was the one thing neither of them would have ever expected. I gave it to Clarissa. She's been with me for almost a decade now, steady, loyal, capable. She was there when business was slow, when clients tried to short me, when storms knocked out half the bookings and we had to rebuild the schedule from scratch. She never asked for ownership. She never hinted. Never overstepped. And yet she carried more of this company than anyone with my last name ever did. 2 months ago, I brought her into my lawyer's office and added her as the sole successor trustee. When I die, she gets it all. Not just the company, but the future. The shop. The contracts. The savings. Even the land it sits on. When I handed her a new set of keys last week, clean set, no label, just silver and steel, she smiled politely, a little confused, and said, "I thought I already had these." I just nodded and said, "Now they're yours." She didn't ask what that meant. But she will. And when the time comes, she'll be ready. I met with my son at the diner 2 weeks after Paige's final email came in. I picked the same booth, same side of the table, same view of the parking lot as the day he told me I wasn't invited to his wedding. He walked in wearing the same cologne I bought him the year he graduated. Sat down slower than usual, like he was waiting for bad news before I even opened my mouth. He didn't order anything. "I just need to understand," he said, looking at me without blinking. "Did you cut me out, completely?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just said, "Everything's already been settled." He didn't cry. But I watched his hand tremble when he reached for his coffee. He didn't expect to lose. Not really. He'd been knocked down before, job interviews, apartment hunting, but never by me. Never in a way that made him question the ground beneath him. This was different. I saw it in his eyes. Not just disappointment. Recognition. He leaned back in the booth, exhaled slowly, and said, "I really thought. I thought this was supposed to be mine someday." I nodded. "Someday." He looked up. "So what changed?" I could have said a dozen things. I could have brought up the wedding. The proposal page sent out with my forged signature. The business accounts she tried to access. The branding firm she hired to erase my name from the letterhead. I could have listed every disrespect, every assumption, every time they used my life like a ladder. But I didn't. I just said. "You made it clear I wasn't family. So I made sure you weren't inheriting one." He didn't speak after that. Just stared down at the table, jaw set, like someone realizing the horizon he spent his whole life walking toward, was never going to get closer. As for Paige, her fall wasn't as loud as I imagined, but it was visible if you knew where to look. Her website disappeared not long after the emails stopped. The consulting firm dissolved quietly. Her Instagram went from branding tips and power couple brunches to grainy quotes about growth through hardship and God's timing. She tried launching a side business, some kind of influencer mentorship program, but it flopped. Probably hard to sell success when the receipts don't exist. The last time she reached out, it was a one-line email. No signature. "I hope we can still work through this as a family." I never replied. Some people only understand silence when it's permanent. The final paperwork was signed the same week. I updated my emergency contact. Took my son's name off every insurance document, financial file, and health directive. Added Clarissa's. My lawyer asked if I wanted to notify them officially, serve the documents, send a formal letter, make the exclusion public. I told him no. Let them find out the way I did. In silence. By the time they get the full picture, it'll be too late to redraw it. I still go into the shop every morning. Still unlock the front door at 6:45. Still keep the lights on over the old wooden desk that's seen every job I've ever built. The walls are still lined with tools, service logs, and photos from the early days. The only thing missing is the framed high school picture of my son I used to keep above the filing cabinet. I took it down after the wedding. Packed it in a box. Didn't throw it out, just moved it someplace it couldn't watch me anymore. He said I wasn't family. So I made sure the next time he needed one, he'd be knocking on a locked door.